On the morning of January 17th, 1781, a 26-year-old British cavalry officer named Bannister Tarleton rode toward a nondescript patch of grazing land in the upstate of South Carolina, known locally as the Cowpens. And he rode there absolutely certain of what was about to happen, because he commanded more than 1,000 of the finest trained soldiers in the entire British Army. And the force waiting for him on the other side of that field was, by every conventional measure, a joke, a ragged collection of American troops, more than half of them untrained militia with a well-earned reputation for dropping their weapons and running the instant a British bayonet caught the morning light. Tarleton expected a massacre, a quick and brutal formality before breakfast. What he rode into instead was one of the most perfectly engineered tactical ambushes in the history of organized warfare. A trap so complete that within a single hour his elite force would be broken beyond recognition. And the man who built that trap, a self-taught backwoods general with no formal military education whatsoever, would deliver a lesson in battlefield psychology that officers still study at West Point more than 2 centuries later. So how exactly did a scattered force of farmers, teamsters, and part-time soldiers manage to annihilate a professional European fighting force in under 60 minutes? And why does this single morning still get taught as one of the finest tactical victories in American history? To understand what happened at the Cowpens, you first have to understand just how desperate things had become for the American cause in the South by the end of 1780. Charleston had fallen to the British the previous May in the worst defeat American forces would suffer during the entire war. More than 5,000 Continental soldiers marched off into captivity in a single stroke. British General Lord Cornwallis effectively controlled the southern colonies. Loyalist militias were terrorizing patriot families across the countryside, and the American Revolution was, by almost any honest assessment, teetering on the edge of total collapse in the South. General George Washington sent Nathanael Greene south to salvage what he could of the Continental Army, and what Greene found when he arrived could barely be called an army at all. Roughly 1,400 exhausted, poorly supplied regulars scattered thinly across the Carolina backcountry. Greene then made a decision that most professional soldiers would have called reckless bordering on insane. Facing an enemy force that outnumbered him, he split his already tiny army in two, sending roughly 600 men west under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, a man whose personal history read like a catalog of the war's most brutal engagements. Morgan was nothing like the polished, aristocratic officers who typically commanded armies in the 18th century. He had grown up poor in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, working as a teamster hauling freight through rough frontier country. And during the French and Indian War, he had received 500 lashes from a British officer after striking a superior, a punishment so severe it left permanent scars across his entire back for the rest of his life. And Morgan reportedly joked afterward that the British still owed him one more lash because the drummer keeping count had lost track. That is not the kind of humiliation a man forgets, and it is not the kind he forgives. When the Revolution began, Morgan showed up leading a company of Virginia riflemen and fought in nearly every major engagement of the Northern campaigns, from the assault on Quebec, where he took a musket ball through the neck and kept fighting, to the forests around Saratoga, where his sharpshooters played a decisive role in breaking General Bergen's army. By 1780, Morgan carried with him not just a deep and personal hatred of the British military, but something far more valuable than any classroom education could ever provide: an intimate, unsentimental understanding of exactly how ordinary men behave when the shooting starts. And this single insight is the detail that makes everything that follows possible. Morgan had fought alongside militia at Saratoga and had watched Virginia riflemen shatter British advances from behind the tree line. But he had also personally witnessed militia units panic and flee at the disastrous Battle of Camden, where a British bayonet charge sent more than 2,000 American soldiers running for their lives within minutes. Most Continental officers looked at that kind of collapse and concluded that militia were simply cowards, unreliable, not worth building a battle plan around. Morgan reached a very different and far more useful conclusion. Militia were not cowards. They were untrained civilians holding muskets, and asking them to stand in an open field trading disciplined volleys with professional British regulars was like asking a group of weekend athletes to hold the line against a professional football team. It was never a question of courage. It was a question of capability, and that honest, almost clinical assessment of exactly what his men could and could not be expected to do became the entire foundation of the trap he was about to build. When Morgan learned that Tarleton was closing in on him with a fast-moving force of more than 1,000 British regulars, dragoons, and loyalist infantry, he faced a straightforward choice. Retreat, try to reunite with Greene, and avoid the confrontation entirely, or stand and fight on ground of his own choosing. Morgan chose to stand, and the place he selected was the Cowpens, an open cattle-grazing pasture in the rolling grasslands of northern South Carolina. And when his officers first saw the position, they were confounded, because on paper it looked like a terrible place to make a stand. The Broad River sat roughly 5 miles behind them, cutting off any realistic route of retreat. The open ground stretched out in every direction with no dense forest to hide in, no swamp to slow a cavalry charge, nothing resembling a natural fortification. Morgan had chosen this ground entirely on purpose, and the reasoning behind it was nothing short of brilliant. He did not want his militia to have anywhere to run, because he knew with total certainty that if an escape route existed, they would eventually use it. By putting a river at their backs, he removed that option completely. There would be no gradual retreat into the trees, no scattering into the countryside. But Morgan was not asking his militia to attempt anything suicidal either. He was asking them to do something very narrow, very specific, and very temporary, and he spent the entire night before the battle walking from campfire to campfire, personally explaining the plan to every single unit under his command. He crouched down beside groups of shivering, frightened militiamen, cracked jokes, told stories about fighting the British at Saratoga, and calmly laid out exactly what he needed from each man individually. He told the militia they would not have to face a bayonet charge. He told them all he wanted was 2 aimed shots, and that they could then walk away from the field with their honor completely intact. He told the Continental regulars they were the wall that nothing would get past. He walked among the cavalry and told them personally that they would be the ones to finish the job. By the time the sun came up, every single soldier on that field understood exactly what his role was and exactly when he needed to play it. A level of direct, personal, face-to-face leadership on the eve of battle that was almost unheard of in 18th century warfare. Picture the battlefield itself from above. Roughly 1,000 yards of gently sloping open pasture rising toward 2 low hills. Morgan organized his forces into 3 deliberate lines, each one positioned about 150 yards behind the one in front of it. The first line was a thin screen of about 150 hand-picked riflemen drawn from Georgia and the Carolinas, frontier marksmen capable of hitting a target at 250 yards with a long rifle, and Morgan gave them one specific instruction: target the officers. When the British advance began, they were to aim for the men wearing epaulettes, the men on horseback, anyone visibly giving orders, and then fall back to the second line once the enemy closed the distance. The second line was the main body of militia, roughly 300 men from the Carolinas under Andrew Pickens, and this is where Morgan's tactical genius shines brightest, because he did not ask these men to hold their ground or fight to the last man. He asked them to do exactly 2 things: fire 2 aimed volleys at the British once they closed to within 50 yards, and then turn, walk to the left, circle around behind the third line, and reform safely in the rear. That was the entire assignment. 2 volleys, then leave the stage. Morgan told them plainly and directly to their faces, "Just give me 2 good fires, boys, and then you can fall back." The third line was the backbone of the entire formation, roughly 450 Continental regulars, and seasoned Virginia militia under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard, positioned on the first low rise behind the militia line. Disciplined troops trained to stand in formation and trade volleys with professional infantry, functioning as the anvil in Morgan's design. And hidden completely out of sight behind the second hill, invisible to any approaching force, waited the hammer. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a cousin of George Washington, commanding roughly 80 Continental dragoons alongside 45 mounted militia cavalry, the killing blow that no one on the British side would see coming until it was already far too late to matter. Now picture the same morning from Tarleton's side of the field. He had spent the previous days chasing Morgan relentlessly across the frozen South Carolina backcountry, pushing his men at a punishing pace. On the night of January 16th, he roused his troops at 2 o'clock in the morning and forced them through nearly 8 miles of pitch-black terrain, across swollen creeks and frozen mud, before dawn. His men had barely eaten. Many had not slept more than a few scattered hours. Horses stumbled in the darkness. Infantry dragged their feet through half-frozen ground. But Tarleton himself was aggressive to the point of recklessness, and he carried a fearsome reputation as one of the most feared cavalry commanders in the American colonies, a reputation earned in part at the Battle of Waxhaws the previous year, where his dragoons had cut down American soldiers attempting to surrender, an incident that earned him the nickname Bloody Tarleton among the colonists who despised him. He did not believe in caution. He believed in speed, in shock, and in the bayonet, and every previous encounter with American militia had reinforced his conviction that they would simply crumble under a fast, aggressive assault. When his scouts reported that Morgan's force was arrayed on open ground with a river at its back, Tarleton saw precisely what Morgan wanted him to see. A trapped, outnumbered force with nowhere left to run, a gift he had no intention of refusing. He ordered an immediate attack without waiting for his exhausted troops to rest, without conducting any meaningful reconnaissance, and without holding back a proper reserve. He formed his infantry into a wide assault line and sent them forward across the frozen pasture at first light. The British first encountered Morgan's skirmish line of riflemen, and shots began cracking across the field from long range almost immediately, British officers dropping from their saddles one after another, a captain here, a sergeant there. The riflemen fired, reloaded, fired again, and then melted backward toward the second line, exactly as Morgan had drilled them to do the night before. The British pressed forward and could now see the militia line ahead of them, a thin formation of rough-looking men in plain civilian clothing, and this was precisely the moment British regulars lived for, the chance to charge undisciplined colonials who would surely break and scatter the way they always had before. Drums beat the advance, bayonets leveled. The line surged forward with a roar. At 50 yards, Pickens gave the order, and the militia line erupted, 300 muskets firing into the British ranks at close range in a single devastating volley. Entire sections of the British formation crumpled instantly, men dropping in rows, thick gray smoke rolling across the field like a curtain. Before the haze had even cleared, the militia reloaded with shaking hands and fired a second volley into the staggering British line. Then, exactly as instructed, they turned and began moving left, circling around behind the Continental position. Some jogged, some walked, a few glanced back over their shoulders at the screaming red-coated soldiers behind them, but they moved together as a unit, following the exact route Morgan had walked them through the night before. They had done their job. 2 good volleys, and now they were leaving the stage precisely on cue. And this is the exact moment Tarleton made the fatal mistake that Morgan had been counting on from the very beginning. When the British saw the militia line turning and moving away, they read it as a rout, as confirmation that the Americans were breaking, that this was Camden happening all over again. Officers shouted for a full pursuit, adrenaline tore through the British ranks, and their disciplined advance dissolved into a headlong charge. Order collapsed entirely. Officers lost control of their formations as soldiers sprinted forward in a disorganized mob. Racing uphill to finish off what they believed was a fleeing, demoralized enemy, bayonets forward, regimental cohesion gone, every instinct telling them the fight was already won. They crested the low rise and ran directly into John Eager Howard's Continental line, fresh troops standing shoulder to shoulder in disciplined formation, muskets loaded and leveled. Howard held his fire, letting the British close to nearly point-blank range, 40 yards, then 30, before finally giving the order to fire. The volley struck the disorganized British charge like a wall, dropping men by the dozen, and before the survivors could even process what had happened, Howard ordered a bayonet charge directly into the stunned and scattered British front line. American regulars slammed into the British at close quarters, and for the first time in the entire engagement, the British began to fall back. At that exact moment, William Washington's cavalry thundered out from behind the second hill and smashed into the exposed British right flank, 80 dragoons at full gallop crashing into a formation already reeling from the frontal assault. The British line buckled, and then came the final piece of Morgan's design. The militia, who had circled around behind the Continental position exactly as planned, now reappeared on the opposite side of the field, reformed into a rough firing line, and advanced with loaded muskets. The British were now being struck from the front by Howard's bayonet charge, from the right by Washington's cavalry, and from the left by the returning militia, a complete double envelopment, a textbook encirclement executed not by seasoned professionals, but by farmers, shopkeepers, and backwoods riflemen against one of the most disciplined armies on earth. British soldiers who had been sprinting forward in triumph only minutes earlier now found themselves surrounded on three sides with nowhere left to go, and the British army simply broke. Not gradually, not in stages, but all at once. Soldiers threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Officers attempted to rally pockets of resistance, but were quickly cut off or overwhelmed. Some clusters of British regulars fought back to back until they were surrounded, while others simply dropped to their knees. Tarleton himself attempted a last desperate cavalry countercharge with his small remaining reserve, but Washington's horsemen met him head-on in a chaotic close-quarters clash, the two commanders reportedly crossing swords personally before Tarleton managed to break free with a handful of mounted survivors and flee the field at a full gallop. The entire battle lasted roughly 1 hour. In that single hour, Morgan's force killed or wounded more than 300 British soldiers and captured nearly 600 more, along with entire artillery crews and their cannons, while Tarleton lost more than 80% of his command. American losses totaled 12 dead and 60 wounded, numbers so lopsided that military historians have spent generations double-checking them simply because the outcome seems almost too complete to be real. Morgan did not simply win a battle that morning. He effectively destroyed an entire British tactical force while suffering only a fraction of the casualties in return, and the way he did it reveals something remarkable about how he thought as a commander. He took what most officers considered the single greatest weakness of his army, the unreliability of untrained militia under direct assault, and transformed it into the centerpiece of an elaborate trap. He used their retreat as bait. He made the British believe they were winning at the precise moment they were actually walking into total destruction. Every line, every movement, every carefully timed withdrawal had been choreographed the night before to pull the British deeper and deeper into a kill zone they did not even recognize until it had already closed around them completely. Morgan refused to fight the battle the British expected him to fight. Instead, he designed a battle the British could not resist fighting, and then simply let their own aggression tear them apart from the inside. The consequences of that single morning rippled far beyond the battlefield itself. The victory at Cowpens shattered the momentum of British strategy in the South almost overnight. Cornwallis lost roughly a quarter of his light infantry and his most aggressive field commander in a matter of hours, and the psychological impact proved just as devastating as the material losses. British officers throughout the Southern theater had built their entire strategic approach around one core assumption, that American militia would always break under direct pressure. And Morgan had just proven that assumption catastrophically wrong in the most public way possible, sending shockwaves through British garrisons stretching from Savannah to Wilmington. Cornwallis, furious and increasingly desperate, burned his own supply wagons in an attempt to lighten his army and chase Greene's forces north into Virginia, a pursuit that stretched his supply lines to the breaking point, exhausted his remaining troops, and pulled him further and further away from any reliable base of support. It was a chase born out of frustration rather than sound strategy, and it eventually led Cornwallis to a small tobacco port on the Chesapeake Bay called Yorktown, where a combined American and French force surrounded him that October, and history remembers exactly how that ended. The army that ultimately surrendered at Yorktown was, in many meaningful ways, the same army that had begun quietly unraveling on that frozen pasture at Cowpens 9 months earlier. What makes the Battle of Cowpens so remarkable, even more than 2 centuries later, is not simply that Morgan's plan worked, but how cleanly and completely it worked. Morgan understood the true character of his own army better than perhaps any other general fighting in that war. He never wished his militia were something other than what they actually were. He never tried to force them into standing and fighting like seasoned regulars. Instead, he gave every man a task that person could realistically accomplish, told them exactly how and when to do it, and built an entire battle plan around the absolute certainty that they would leave the field after completing that task, because that retreat was never a failure baked into the plan. The retreat was the plan. Military academies around the world still teach Cowpens today as a foundational case study in the tactic of double envelopment, in the discipline of understanding exactly what your own forces are capable of, and in the art of using an enemy's own aggression as a weapon against them. Historians have long compared it to Hannibal's stunning victory at Cannae in 216 BC, where the Carthaginian general lured advancing Roman legions into a deadly pocket by deliberately allowing his center to bend inward, while his flanks swung around to close the trap, and the comparison has held up for over 2 centuries of military scholarship. But Hannibal commanded veteran Carthaginian infantry and Numidian cavalry, seasoned warriors who had spent years training specifically for that kind of coordinated maneuver. Daniel Morgan achieved something arguably even more difficult using militia who had been farming corn only weeks earlier, on a quiet cattle pasture in the South Carolina backcountry, against a professional opponent who, by any reasonable expectation, should have known far better than to fall for it. Tarleton spent much of the rest of his life trying to explain away exactly what happened to him that morning, shifting blame in every direction except toward himself. His superiors criticized him for charging without proper reconnaissance. Cornwallis effectively blamed the collapse of the entire Southern campaign on the losses sustained in that single hour. But the uncomfortable truth is that none of them were remotely prepared for what Daniel Morgan had quietly built on that frozen field. A trap so elegantly constructed that the enemy did precisely what Morgan needed them to do at every single stage of the engagement, and never once realized it until the entire operation was already over. The ground at Cowpens is quiet today. A national battlefield park now occupies the site, with markers showing exactly where each line stood and where William Washington's cavalry launched their decisive charge. And the rolling pasture still looks remarkably similar to how it appeared back in January of 1781. Green grass, gentle hills, open sky stretching in every direction. Standing there now, it is easy to forget that for one single freezing hour on a January morning, this unremarkable patch of farmland hosted one of the most lopsided and tactically perfect victories in the entire history of American warfare. A victory won not through superior numbers or superior equipment, but through one commander's brutally honest understanding of exactly who his men were, exactly what they could do, and exactly how to turn an opponent's own overconfidence into the very instrument of his destruction.